Hello again. This is Jessum Guy, and this is Jessum Guy's podcast, and this is episode 5. The chief aims of this elaborate, semi-secret organization were largely commendable: to coordinate the international activities and outlooks of all the English-speaking world into one, to work to maintain the peace, to help backward, colonial, and underdeveloped areas to advance towards stability, law and order, and prosperity, along lines somewhat similar to those taught at Oxford and the University of London, especially the School of Economics. It was this group of people, whose wealth and influence so exceeded their experience and understanding, who provided much of the framework of influence which the communist sympathizers and fellow travelers took over in the United States in the 1930s. It must be recognized that the power that these energetic left-wingers exercised was never their own power or communist power, but was ultimately the power of the international financial coterie, and once the anger and the suspicions of the American people were aroused, as they were by 1950, it was fairly simple matter to get rid of the red sympathizers. Before this could be done, however, a congressional committee, following backward to their source, the threads which led from admitted communists like Whittaker Chambers, through Alger Hiss and the Carnegie Endowment, to Thomas Lamont and the Morgan Bank, fell into the whole complicated network of the interlocking tax-exempt foundations. The 83rd Congress in July 1953 set up a special committee to investigate tax-exempt foundations with Representative Carol Reese of Tennessee as chairman. It soon became clear that the people of immense wealth would be unhappy if the investigation went too far, and that the most respected newspapers in the country, closely allied with these men of wealth, would not get excited enough about any revelations to make the publicity worthwhile in terms of votes or campaign contributions. An interesting report showing the left-wing associations of the interlocking nexus of tax-exempt foundations was issued in 1954 rather quietly. 4 years later, the Reese Committee's General Counsel, Rene Wormer, wrote a shocked but not shocking book on the subject called Foundations, Their Power and Influence. So that was page 954 and 955 of Tragedy and Hope, and in my opinion is one of the main reasons why Quigley decided to write this book. In the 50s, we had HUAC, and we had, the McCarthy era Red Scare, and they decided that they needed to investigate all the way down to tax-exempt foundations, and because they were funding some really odd things in those times. And when they set up this investigation by the Congress, they started to, recognize that there were these, quote, commies infiltrating all of these foundations and their institutions. But what Quigley is telling you here is that this has nothing to do with the Soviets and the KGB spies, that this entire thing from its inception was directed by the Eastern American establishment. And so here at the end, he names Rene Wormer's book, Foundations, Their Power and Influence, which we are going to discuss today, because it is the many revelations of what was found by the investigators like Norman Dodd, who we've talked about, and you've listened to clips of his interview before. And I'm going to insert into the Tragedy and Hope series because it's pretty significant. And I'm going to follow it up with Lily Kay's book, The Molecular Vision of Life, which deals with very similar topics. I'm going to try to combine the two of those together into one episode Hopefully it doesn't get too long. That's the goal. So what did they discover? What was the summation of foundations by Rene Wormer? Well, a little backstory. The congressional committee was cut short due to a lot of pressure by the, quote, liberal press at the time. And we already know that this press was under the same controls as the people that are creating all these foundations. So Congress never really had an opportunity to provide all this information to the public. So this is why Rene Wormer wrote this book. The main conclusions that they found were that these foundations were not using this tax-free money, your tax dollars. They weren't using it for charity or philanthropy. They were using it for what they called social planning, social engineering. That they used this money in their influence in the fields of the social sciences, and they believed that that could alter the basic moral, social, and economic governmental processes. This is something that I believe is blindingly obvious today. They believe that they exerted tremendous influence over the educational institutions through these grants or withholding of grants, so that way they can alter academic opinions. They discovered this interlocking, what we talked about before, the spin networks between the foundations, Ford Foundation, Carnegie, Rockefeller, and such, the corporations themselves, Rockefeller, Standard Oil, such, and institutions that not only that they created, but also are intertwined with government and with education, major universities. They found that these foundation funds are left to professional employees of said corporations. So the Ford Foundation's funds are under someone that Ford himself would hire. They discovered that they control the research in social sciences and in the educational processes as well. They found that these foundations have significant influence over the press and in government themselves, and even certain government funds would flow through the organizations that these tax-exempt foundations would set up. They discovered that these foundations use their control of education and the sciences and such to promote, quote, scientism. They also heavily promote moral relativity, which, they support the concept, again, of social engineering. They found, and again, this is in the 50s, you got to remember their uses of the words liberal and so on and so forth, but they promoted leftist ideology. Again, we kind of talked about this in episode 1. We talk about the Twitter handle Woke Capital. We get this now. They exercised, again, their influence over education, but specifically in the textbooks and with the teachers, the training of the teachers. So, they can control basically what goes in the textbooks that your kids read. And then they found the overlapping between these foundations and their institutions that they fund and foreign policy and education and things, quote, international. So they promote globalism and world government. And then another way to control education is through the accrediting organizations which they created and they funded. So, and they also are staffed with the trustee selected employees. So the people that staff the accrediting organizations are put there by the trustees themselves. So this is a basic summation of what we're going to find in Rene Wormer's book, Foundations into Power. These are things that just didn't make it to the public because, this congressional investigation was shut down. And a little background on Rene Wormer himself. He was the general counsel to this special congressional committee investigation, and he drafted the final majority report, which is the basis for this book. In 69 through 71, he was a member of an advisory committee to the Commissioner of Internal Revenue on tax-exempt organizations. He is a lawyer who specialized in estate planning and wrote 6 books on the subject. and he was a partner and founder in 1930 of the New York law firm Wormer, Keeley, Alessandroni, Hyde, and McCann. And he was chairman of the advisory committee of the University of Miami's Institute on Estate Planning, which he helped establish. He was also an adjunct professor in the graduate program of the University of Miami Law School. So again, this is not a conspiracy book. This is not a conspiracy kook. This is the final report of congressional investigation into tax-exempt foundations. And so beginning in Chapter 1, deals with the study of foundations. There were previous investigations into these foundations, as well as other independent studies and books written about these, namely the Walsh Commission, which was the Commission on Industrial Relations, examined these foundations under the Congressional Act of August 12, 1912, and its main purpose was to study labor conditions and the treatment of workers by major industrial firms. Starting with a study of labor exploitation, it went on to investigate concentrations of economic power, interlocking directorates, and the role of the then relatively new large charitable foundations, especially the Carnegie and the Rockefeller, as instruments of power concentration. So in the early days, they were already recognizing the consolidation of wealth by these large corporations, and just as we see Viacom, Disney, and so on and so forth, consolidating, getting larger, absorbing, other corporations. That was page 5. Page 10, they were concerned with this concentration of wealth and influence, and this Walsh Commission report concluded from the evidence examined that a small number of wealthy and powerful financiers held in their hands the final control of American industry. That control through actual stock ownership, in spite of the large numbers of stockholders, rested with a small number of persons, and that in each great basic industry, a single large corporation dominated the market. On page 11, he refers to the report of Mr. Manley for the majority of the commission, and he says they saw, quote, the domination by men in whose hands the final control of a large part of American industry rests, rapidly extending to the control of education and social service of the nation. The control is being extended largely through the creation of enormous privately managed funds for the indefinite purposes hereinafter designated foundations, by the endowment of colleges and universities, by the creation of funds for pensioning teachers, by contributions to private charities, as well as through controlling or influencing the public press. The funds of these foundations are exempt from taxation, yet during the life of their founders are subject to their dictation for any purpose other than commercial profit. Other studies into tax-exempt foundations cited in this book, their studies of the support of ideas and organizations by tax-exempt foundations, they concluded that foundations had become the breeding grounds for socialists and related political movements in action. Among these ideas are the welfare state, the principles of economic determinism, excesses in the promotion of progressive education, and the impairment of our national sovereignty, and even subversion. These are the things that, when they study the foundations, this is the ideas that these foundations would support. And previously, these other researchers recognized the interlocking relationship they had with the boards of large universities, and it is documented by numerous names of multiple trusteeship holders. And they point to the invasion of the foundation boards of trustees by the trustees of universities, in addition to emergence of university teachers as the professional managers of said foundations. They also heavily funded controversial studies like Dr. Kinsey's sex research, which is something that we'll come upon later. On page 34, he talks about how a foundation was to finance a public educational campaign and the principles of world government. Quote, supported by a foundation for world government endowed with $1 million by Miss Anita McCormick Blaine, a tax-exempt committee to frame a world constitution under Chancellor Robert Hutchins of the University of Chicago, a Rockefeller school, wrote a program for a world republic in 1948. The foundation was to finance a public education campaign and the principles of world government. The proposed constitution advocated, among other things, a national surrender to a world government of expropriation rights, control of plans for the improvement of the world's physical facilities, the power of taxation, regulation of transportation, and similar prerogatives of national governments. And Mr. Hutchins is the president of the Ford Foundation's offshoot, the Fund for the Republic. And he was quoted as saying that world government is necessary, therefore it is or must be made possible. Direct quote. Move along to chapter 2, which covers the power of the individual foundation. And the giant foundation, they note, can exercise enormous power through the direct use of its funds. Moreover, it materially increases this power and its influence by building what he says is collateral alliances. The quote on page 41 is, "It is likely to find friends among the banks which hold its great deposits, the investment and brokerage houses which serve its investment problem, the major law firms which act as its counsel, and the many firms, institutions, and individuals with which it deals and which it benefits. By careful selection of a trustee here and there from among proprietors and executives of newspapers, periodicals, and other media of communication, it can assure itself adulation and support." So again, we have this spin network that we've discussed many times. On page 42 through 43, he discusses the foundation grants and funds and how they influence universities, and how they also control the journals and university press. He says, great dispensing intermediary organizations control learned journals and university presses. They hold the key to academic publications and form an effective instrument of patronage. In Norman Dodd's interview, he also noted they meant to control the history books. And again, this is something we will see a little bit later when we get into Lily Kay's book next. But this also shows that research isn't without bias. And to secure grants and to continue work, researchers at these universities have to conform. Again, something heavily covered in Lily Kay's book. And to quote a Professor Colgrove on page 48, he says, "In the aggregate, the officers of these foundations wield such staggering sum of influence and direction upon research, education, and propaganda in the United States and even in foreign countries." And on page 54, he talks about at that time, there were about 2,000 foundations, and their aggregate capital, joint planning, and joint support of intermediary organizations bred conformity. And the conformity which these techniques foster is, what he says, socially unsound and highly undesirable. And he says this stems partly from the use of common groups of experts. So they only get the opinions of, quote, experts, which promote these ideas directly from the foundation themselves. So you have this, quote, consensus of ideas, because it's the same experts across the board no matter which way you look at it. Moving along to Chapter 3, deals with the concentration of power. This is where they uncovered what we called before the spin network. And on page 57 and 58, he talks about the overlapping membership, the Rockefeller Foundation, Carnegie Foundations, and so on and so forth. They employed the same men to run their foundations. And this is how you essentially can combine the fortunes of all these people for massive fund to direct any movement or idea. And again, this also creates conformity. And again, on page 59 and 60, he deals with foundation trustees often serve in more than one tax-exempt foundation, usually on the granting and the receiving organizations. The joint control of fund-receiving institutions from multiple foundations, how foundation personnel usually staff these institutions, and foundation officials on the staff of the government advisory boards are the ones that are in control of policy and or spending. On page 60 and 61, they found that only a handful of these universities received almost 100% of the grants from these foundations, something that's covered a little bit better and a little deeper in Lily Kay's book, Next. And page 62, he deals with, the foundations and the institutions they create and then fund that have think tanks of experts that use said funds to promote their agenda, like the Institute of Pacific Relations, were promoting communism in China. Something you could read about a little bit more in the New York Times piece, China Traveler by David Rockefeller. And this, again, is fleshed out in detail in Tragedy and Hope. Back on page 45 of this book, the Institute of Pacific Relations, an arm of the Carnegie and Rockefeller, was an organ of the Communist Party in the United States. And then, again, in Tragedy and Hope, we're going to learn a lot more about the IPR when we cover that. But again, this committee thought that these were communists promoting communism in China using the foundations, when Quigley's telling us, no, this was the Anglo-American establishment using communists to their ends. Pages 63, 64, 65, they do a real good job of fleshing out in pretty good detail exactly how a lot of this is organized and set up. And as he states, rather than distribute money without strings attached, these foundations favor projects of their own and supply the recipient institutions not only with the program, but also with the staff and the detailed operations budget, so that the project is actually under the control of the foundation, while professionally benefiting from the prestige of the recipient institution. The choice of professors often is won by the foundation and not won by the universities. Foundation employees frequently switch from work in the foundation or in the councils supported by the foundation to work on sponsored projects and in professional organizations supported by their funds. They become most influential in the professional organizations. They are elected to presidencies and generally rule the research institute or industry. And this is how they create consensus among academic experts. They supply the people, the program, the money. They direct it from start to finish. There is no such thing as unbiased science and an unbiased research. And then these foundations create and then support centralized agencies that operate as instruments of control by claiming authority in a field of education, science, arts, etc., etc. So when they get up there and they say, the science is settled. All scientists agree, and all the research proves climate change is man-made, and we have 12 years to live unless you hand over all your sovereignty and your money and reduce your meat consumption and eat grass out in the field and no longer have eggs and bacon and live in this tiny little box on top of a Target. Yeah, these are the people giving you that, quote, consensus and the science that is settled. Now, on 65-66, they actually talk about the Rand Corporation, which is something that we're going to learn a little bit more about later in Tragedy and Hope, something you can learn a lot more about in Annie Jacobson's The Pentagon's Brain. But they play an important role in governmental research. And lo and behold, the trustees for Rand are also the trustees for Carnegie, Ford, and Rockefeller foundations. On page 66, he talks about how the social science consultants serving the research and development boards of the Department of Defense are foundation executives that are the appointed experts, controlling the expenditure of government funds and research. Again, so this is how the spin network bleeds into the government. So now, not only do they avoid paying taxes and use that money to do whatever they want, they then dictate how the government spends your tax dollars. Moving along to page 72, they start to deal with the Social Science Research Council. And we get into the social sciences here. And he discusses how the Social Science Research Council gives the impression that it represents the majority of social sciences, which is used to affect control of the field of social sciences. So again, we see that they create institutions that are propagandized as experts that then give us what the consensus is. And by having institutions like the SSRC dictate what gets research funding and who gets them, they then have control over the scientific journals. This also has implications of influencing school teachers and the textbook writers, because they have the power to recommend books for purchase in public schools and libraries. And so the foundation-supported institutions then act as the de facto accrediting institutions by controlling the funding of research and weeding out nonconformists. On page 76, Wormer deals with the American Council on Education. Among its supporters and funders are the General Education Board, which is a Rockefeller institution, the Carnegie Corporation, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Fund for Adult Education, the Alfred P. Sloan Fund, the Payne Fund, B'nai B'rith, interesting, the G. Edward W. Hazen Foundation, the Grant Foundation, and the Alice L. Phillips Foundation. And what they claim to do is they act as a, quote, clearinghouse. It is that they acted as a liaison agency between the educational institutions of the country and the federal government, and has undertaken many significant projects at the request of the Army, Navy, and the State Department and other governmental agencies. And it has made available to the educator and the general public widely used handbooks, informational reports, and many volumes of critical analysis of social and educational problems. So again, the people that are in control of your children's education come from the Rockefeller, Carnegie, Ford Foundations, among others. And on page 80, he notes that this same foundation employees also direct or advise on the expenditures of the federal government in areas of social sciences. So not only do they control your education, they control the social sciences. And what is the ideas that they promote? Mainly it's the one of cultural lag. I believe that's been debunked by now. But they also promote that laws, values, and affairs need to adjust to technological changes. An adoption of Marx's economic determinism, which impels its believers to strive for permanent revolution. This is the purpose and the ideology of the elite, not the commies. Again, got to make note that these aren't the commies doing this. Moving along to chapter 4, it deals with social sciences and what they call scientism. And again, what do we see? The social scientists that work for foundation institutions serve as the experts and advisors to numerous governmental agencies. On page 87 and 88, Wormer quotes the work of a Professor Dr. Hobbes, who wrote a book called The Claims of Sociology, a Critique of Textbooks. So he wrote about sociology and he critiqued the textbooks, and he discovered by reading hundreds of textbooks on sociology used in high school and college, he discovered they were filled with virtually all the SJW crap we see in everyday lexicon today. I'll read you a quote of what he says. Lamentation about war, economic maldistribution, and individual unhappiness. It appears, however, to be secular, materialistic, short-term humanitarianism. It is liberal if the term applies to doctrinaire criticisms of economic maldistribution, of inequalities between sexes, classes, and races, and of social controls which inhibit each person's full expression of his own personality. It is not completely liberal, however, if this term applies to a tolerant historical perspective and a balanced and unbiased presentation of controversial issues in society. It is objective if this term applies only to critical emphasis against institutions and traditions. It is lacking in objectivity, however, and uncritical acceptance of platitudinous remedies and goals for society. It is scientific if this term includes a process of selection of only certain aspects of quantitative data in certain types of studies. It is not scientific if the term excludes the use of unverified hypotheses and proceeding from unwarranted assumptions to untenable conclusions. Correct. And what have we seen recently from the New York Times? The 1619 Project, which highlights the fact that the only reason America has any exceptionalism whatsoever is because it had slaves. So they're going to tell the story of America through the lens of racism, and nothing else, literally nothing else in the world has ever mattered. And this is what these people do. And this leads to the foundations that promote scientism, which means the concept that social problems can be solved in the same manner as the physical by scientific method. These social scientists call themselves social engineers. And again, this is the idea that first you deny objective truths and objective realities. You promote relativism, and then you say, well, the only reason we have these problems is because of this, that, and the other, and the only way to solve these problems is through fill in the blank about science. And starting on page 91, 92, 93, he actually gives a great critique of the social sciences for their use of empiricism, or he says lack thereof. This combined with the appearance of being, quote, scientific, and the belief that empiricism is better than logic and reason, or the only way to gain facts, this is scientism. The idea of fact-finding through empirical methods only. Now, this leads to moral relativity, and that facts must dictate moral law. And on page 94, here are some of the quotes coming directly from the Social Science Research Council in their statement to the committee. Quote, and its 1927 report included among its aims to make possible the substituting of more scientific social control for the rule of thumb methods which men have happened upon in their effort to live together. The Social Science Research Council and its first issue of Items. Here, we wish simply to emphasize that in our generation, efforts are being made to arrange and control human relationships more consciously, more deliberately, and it is to be hoped more responsibly than during the last century. An interdependent world is being forced to an awareness of the limitations of individual freedom and personal choice. And still from SSRC on page 95, quote, a sounder empirical method of research had to be achieved in political science if it were to assist in the development of a scientific political control. Political control is thus to be left in the hands of the elite and the social engineers. What the people want is not necessarily good for them, and they are not competent to decide. And something I saw on page 98 that I thought was pretty interesting, his critique of scientism and what he called the fact-finding mania. He understood that massive amounts of data on people is used for social engineering. He says on page 98 that it seems that the only way this can be of any use is with, quote, the all-remembering, all-indexing, and all-tabulating electronic robot. Again, he wrote this in 58. I don't think he knew that the same year this book was published, DARPA was created, and the first computer was already being created. That's a whole interesting topic on its own. You can read Pentagon's Brain to get a little deeper into that history. But I just thought it was interesting that he understood that the massive amounts of data that were constantly being gathered through scientism, he understood how it could be used. He just didn't think it could be at that time because they did not have the all-indexing, all-remembering, and so on and so forth. Just thought that was pretty interesting, pretty astute observation by Mr. Wormer there. On page 101, he discusses the Rockefeller Foundation's heavily funding of Alfred Kinsey's sex research. If you weren't already aware, in this study, at least 317 adolescents were sexually experimented on by adults. His studies were published and were used in textbooks and in court cases. Disgusting, really. And this completely altered how Americans viewed themselves and sexuality. And it helped, in my opinion, to usher in the sexual revolution. This is the level of influence scientism has on our society. Now, what is not listed in this book here is Kinsey's association with MKUltra doctors like Ewan McCameron, and as well as him being an occultist, and he was reportedly obsessed with Aleister Crowley. You could just read the quotes on page 102, 103. Just read the quotes for yourselves directly from Mr. Kinsey, and you will understand today's backwards thinking by these degenerate SJWs that we're dealing with. He sees, and these are like his own quotes and stuff, sees homosexuality as normal and natural. Heterosexuality is only a social construct. Pedophilia is normal, and he thinks it contributes favorably to a child. Promiscuity in females and premarital sex is beneficial. Overall, in Kinsey's report, he is questioning all basic norms and traditions regarding marriage, male and female sexual behavior, and laws. So this is what Rockefeller's put money towards research, just so you know. And page 104, he notes that this is only accepted, even though it is contrary to everything we've been taught for generations. It is accepted because it has the word science behind it. And this is where Wormer gives a great critique of scientism and the confusion most have about what is fact, opinion, and a priori concept of value. And so when you read these stupid articles like research shows XYZ blah blah blah, 40-year-old single women who drink boxed wine and own 13 cats have better sex and are happier than married 25-year-olds. Yeah, this is the nonsense we're talking about here. This is not science on any level. And again, page 113. What is the goal of the social scientists that receive their funding and prestige from these large foundations and their subsidiaries? Society to be managed by a scientific elite using the scientific method applied to human behavior. Through cultural determinism, they will mold the minds through propaganda, inculcate a new culture targeting the youth. He says it's brainwashing akin to Pavlov's conditioning of dogs, and he is exactly right. If it isn't already obvious to you that what we see today is a result of 60 years of this, you aren't paying attention. And on page 114, Professor Hobbes lends another great criticism of the social sciences. Quote, zealots of the new research in social sciences lead people to believe that techniques exist in social science which provide accurate description and enable prediction of social behavior. We are told to pattern our behavior and to change our society on the basis of such conclusions regarding criminality, race relations, marriage, mental health, war, divorce, sex, and other personal and social affairs. Yet in these areas of behavior, the pertinent knowledge is extremely limited and unreliable. The rules of behavior are vague and changeable. The techniques are crude and untested. And even the basic units required for measurement are non-existent. Again, character and integrity are dissolved in the acid ridicule of cultural determinism. And this idea of social behavior, controlling social behavior, is going to be a much deeper topic when we talk about Lily Kay's book next. And so how significant are the social scientists that work for these large foundations? Because I don't want to overstate this here. But on page 116, he cites the case of the Supreme Court Brown versus Board of Education. They used a book written by a European socialist that was funded by Carnegie as an authority for its ruling. I repeat, a Supreme Court case in the United States used a foundation publication as an authority to make a ruling on one of the most significant cases in U.S. history. Think about that. On page 120, we have another example of a foundation-funded man creating what's called the New School for Social Research, editing the Encyclopedia of the Social Sciences, as well as the editor of the, quote, New Republic, which we read in Quigley was a J.P. Morgan created paper. And this theme of the foundation having a heavy hand in the social sciences and using their money and influence to give the social sciences credibility is found through this whole book. And again, something covered deeper in Lily Kay. But also what we've found out recently with our talks with Kevin Cole was Charles Beard, the author of The Economic Interpretation of the Constitution. He actually helped found this new school with Rockefeller money. And he was actually one of the men responsible for bringing in the Frankfurt Marxists, which also we found, I think was used, was through the OSS. Sorry. And on page 129, we see another professor that gave his testimony to the Reese Committee on the overemphasis of the empirical method of the Foundation-supported social sciences and their research. Again, he notes this leads to materialism, relativism, etc. And on page 130, he makes the astute observation of the tendency to conflate intellectualism with liberalism and conservatism with anti-intellectual. This is the propaganda, that is fostered by the foundations. We see it on our, overlords from the mainstream press and Hollywood and so on and so forth. And on pages 134 through 137, again, the critiques of what the committee called mass research, which is the foundation's use of their funds to promote a collective science group project, so to speak. Lily Kay talks a lot about this in her book, but he talks about they weed out the individual researchers and they create a mass consensus and conformity to the ideas that the foundations desire for their agendas, all while using the veneer of science, which lends them the credibility. The idea that science is objective truth-finding is nonsense. The research funded is always according to predetermined plans and goals. So moving into Chapter 5, deals with the foundations and their role in our education. Starting on page 139, our entire education system is controlled by Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Ford foundations. The way to exercise control is through the grants. You either conform to the desires of the foundations or you lose your funding. Some of the examples they cite on page 41 of foundations that force schools to abandon their religious affiliations to conform to requirements of the foundations to continue receiving grants. And then also any resistance from administrators gets, drowned out by the amplified messaging of publications ran by these foundations. The foundations created the accrediting institutions to reform education. These institutions, created and funded by Rockefeller, Carnegie, and Ford foundations, control our primary, secondary, and higher education, namely through the American Council on Education. Page 143 talks about the foundations promote and fund socialist movements within education. And see the example of the League for Industrial Democracy. Sounds innocuous, right? Well, they were originally founded as the Intercollegiate Socialist Society, created for the promotion of socialism. They established many branches in colleges and universities, then go on to operate as a tax-exempt foundation, and their movement is likened to Fabian socialism. Later on, there is a crossover with them and the student movements of the 60s that were funded and directed by the CIA. That's not in this book, but that's just through the research. And now the committee was aware of John Dewey's teachings of relativism. And John Dewey, for those who do not already know, was a major educational reformer, and his work was heavily involved in setting up our modern education system with funds from the major foundations. Mr. Dewey here, he denies objective truths, promotes relativity, and schematicism and pragmatism. And on page 145, the connections of Dewey to Rockefeller are shown, but what is also noted is the foundation's role of, quote, reform agitation, which is the use of fostering socialist ideas with the discontented as a way to change things to their benefit. In the very early 1900s, this was applied to education to bring in Dewey's reform ideas. Outside of this scope, one should understand Dewey's teachings and philosophy and understand why his ideas aren't one that benefits you and I. But on this page, even back in the 50s, they were aware that radicalism and socialism is no grassroots movement, something we discussed in episode 1. It does not spring from the masses, but is instigated by foundation-funded intellectuals. Exactly. Now, keeping in mind the Red Scare of this era, the term socialism carried more of a pejorative weight than it does today. Being called a socialist in those days was like being called a racist today. So on page 149 and 150, keep that in mind. And when the commission studied the Carnegie records, they recognized that Carnegie was funding the means by which the Board of Education was training teachers to indoctrinate children to accept a more socialist society. They do this by controlling the textbooks, the curriculum, and the teacher training. Now, I'm not here to argue the merits of socialism versus capitalism, but just pointing out the education system is privately controlled by the wealthiest elite, and that the largest capitalists want you to accept socialism. Why? Think about that. And on page 156, 157, we see that foundation-supported, quote, experts write the textbooks our children learn from. And Wormer notes that the research shows that they are all written to highlight America's faults and give students a pathological view of their country. He cites the Rugg textbooks. Rugg, who worked through the Lincoln Experimental School, which is a Rockefeller school. And we definitely see this in schools today. It's out in the open and is no longer a secret. This anti-white, anti-American sentiment that is coming from teachers in schools, and especially in colleges, is brutal. And this is where this crap's coming from. And, on page 158, he also notes the idea of progress, progress. Progress for progress's sake. This is, promoted as in constant change is not only desirable, but it is necessary. And yes, it is noted on page 161 that textbooks given to students that are written by foundation-funded educators falsify history. And as a fan of history and a student of history, I see this as one of the biggest issues that we have today. And on 166, when studying sociology texts, they found that they call for the use of social sciences as a program of social planning. In other words, social engineering. And what is the point of all this? Controlling education. Some researchers state that it's to create mindless workers for factories. And in my opinion, I think that's lazy analysis. Controlling a people's history can create solidarity. Think Johann Fichte, can't pronounce his name right. Or the inverse, it can destroy a people group's identity, calling into question tradition, objectivity, ideologies, etc. One can look to 1984 to the quote, "He who controls the history controls the future," is something to that effect. Destroying distinctions and identities are stated goals by many of the globalist elite, as we will see when we continue to read this type of material. And this is also a reason Marxism is used. Not so much because it is sound economic theory, but it destroys traditional and especially Western societies. And with that moves us on to chapter 6, what he calls the Third American Revolution. And it is on this page 174, it is where the committee finds communists infiltrating the foundations and the government. And this is where Wormer and the committee gets wrong, and where Quigley's work is so important. Because on this page, Wormer writes that the previous committee concluded, and Wormer agrees with this, that the infiltration was Moscow directed, using the foundations as a cover and using their funds for subversion and propaganda. And again, Quigley tells us that this has nothing to do with Russian commies, but was directed directly by the round table groups and the banking elite the entire time they used commies. Wormer is aware of the financing wing of the plot coming from the foundations, but just apparently wasn't aware of the roundtables and the banking elite that controlled them, I suppose. And he deals with IPR, Institute of Pacific Relations, multiple times throughout this book, again on page 176. And again, they're aware of them. I just don't think they knew the depth of it as it is laid out in Tragedy and Hope. On page 177, Worms and the committee were also aware of the early neocons and the dangers that they posed to America, which is pretty interesting. And on page 186, again, discussing the subversive nature of the foundation-funded social sciences, how they hide behind the label science to make them seem legit and beyond rebuttal, although there's nothing scientific about these social science projects of mass data gathering and biased interpretations. And for me personally, this is my biggest issue and critique with the sciences of modern day. It's not that I'm anti-science, just that the term science is used as the vehicle to make people accept nonsense, and people's entire worldview or narrative is just science. I'm sure you've heard people say, "I believe in science," like it's a damn religion. It drives me nuts. But the quote on page 186, "Moreover, the subversive projects have been offered with spurious claims to science. With this false label, they have been awarded a privileged status. They have been offered as scientific, and therefore beyond rebuttal. The impact of these subversive works have been intensified manifold by the sponsorship of foundations." And so, moving along to Chapter 7, the Foundation's Impact on Foreign Policy. Starting on page 200, this chapter is about control over foreign policy by foundation-supported think tanks, and he names the Council on Foreign Relations, as well as the Institute of Pacific Relations. And he understood then the policies that they supported and the globalist nature of said policies. On page 201, he actually talks about the Rhodes Scholarship and how they train the elite at Oxford, and then they come home to take positions of influence. He also refers to the Roundtable member Frank Adiolet's book, The Rhodes Trusts. And this is something you should already be familiar with reading and talking about Tragedy and Hope. And then on page 202, he then lists all of the foundation trustees and members and employees that were Rhodes Scholars. And he links Cecil Rhodes to Carnegie. And we discussed this with Kevin Cole on our last podcast. Thank you, Kevin. On page 202 and 203, he lists the main foundations that are concentrated on internationalism. And these are the Carnegie Corporation, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, the Rockefeller Foundation, and recently the Ford Foundation. And he speaks of their conferences and forums, which are used to create consensuses. Again, we know this from episode 1 as a spin. On page 204 and 205, he points out that the Carnegie Foundation was essential to getting the United States into war. And we heard this directly from Dodd himself in his interview. The Carnegie Foundation was the propaganda machine for internationalism. The reason for publishing so much about international affairs in American media, it was to get people to think internationally. And it's worked, because now we have people basically saying fuck borders and sovereignty and shit. And there's this good quote on page 205, quote, "An extremely powerful propaganda machine was created. It spent many millions of dollars in the production of masses of material for distribution, the creation and support of large numbers of international policy clubs and other logical organizations at colleges and elsewhere, the underwriting and dissemination of many books on various subjects through the international mind alcoves, and the international relations clubs and centers, which it organized all over the country. The collaboration with agents of publicity, such as newspaper editors, the preparation of material to be used in school textbooks, and cooperation with publishers of textbooks to incorporate this material, the establishing of professorships at the colleges, and the training and indoctrination of teachers, the financing of lectures, and the importation of foreign lecturers and exchange professors, the support of outside agencies touching the international field, such as the Institute of International Education, the Foreign Policy Association, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the American Council on Education, the American Council on Learned Societies, the American Historical Association, the American Association of International Conciliation, the Institute of Public Relations, the International Parliamentary Union, and others, and acting as a midwife at the birth of some of them. On page 209, there is a nice paragraph about the Council on Foreign Relations that was financed and created by Rockefeller and Carnegie, and how they control and staff the State Department and basically run the United States foreign policy. One of the stated objectives of the CFR was to write the history of World War II, to prevent historians from criticizing policies as they did with World War I. In other words, they write our history books and control the historical narrative. This is why almost everyone I know has no idea the importance of World War I through the Cold War. And this can also be seen in modern-day mythologies, the retelling of race and countries to convince people there should be no borders and distort how people view nations and people groups and such. You understand? Now, the foundations have been controlling foreign policy through propagandizing the public and making decisions for State Department as early as 1925, as stated in their own reports. They make the decisions, then control the narrative to make you think you wanted it. The committee recognized at that time the concentration of power. The foundations, the UN, the Rhodes Trust, CFR, IPR, these is where the ideas of globalism are fostered. On page 214, he points out that the experts used go through the international relations indoctrination. And this is something that I discussed with Kevin Cole, and how they created a field of international relations just out of whole cloth. And they use their wealth and influence to get accreditation, and then they churn out these experts. And of course their ideology is globalism and an end to nation states and sovereignty. And on page 214 again, highlights how Carnegie is the propaganda arm of this complex shilling for the UN. And we see on page 215, UNESCO was their creation to control education. And on page 219, the infamous Alger Hiss of Carnegie, he also thought it was a good idea to use movies in public education on world affairs, something that Jay Dyer and myself had discussed and he's written complete books on. So moving along, Chapter 8 deals with the Ford Foundation. Now, the Ford Foundation took over from Rockefeller Foundation in the behavioral sciences, which ties into MKUltra, which is something we will see later in Lily Kay's book next. But for now, this is Wormer and the committee's critique of the social sciences ran by the Ford Foundation. On page 225, Wormer gives a good philosophical presuppositional critique of the foundations and their a priori assumptions. And the next few pages leading up to 230 gives a sound critique of the foundation's stated goals and ideas. And on 229, he quotes the president of Lafayette College address, giving the proper critique of scientism and the idea of progress, ideas that are heavily funded and promoted by the foundations. One of these ideas, scientism ideas, is the improvability of man. He discusses on page 231. Now, the idea of the improvability of man is an a priori assumption of value. One needs to ask their definition of, quote, improve. This is out of this scope, but is tackled in great length by other authors, and we will touch upon their definition later in Tragedy and Hope, when Quigley describes what the new system will look like. But their idea of approving man is a eugenics program, and this is something we're going to see next in Lily Kay's book. But moving into page 233, he gives some of the overlapping memberships and ties of the foundations. As we have already saw, there was the RAND Corporation, the New School for Social Research, and again, it was the New School for Social Research and their university in exile with funding from Rockefeller Foundation that, with the help of the OSS, brought the Frankfurt School Marxists into America. Now, other associations of members and students of the NSSR, they're far too extensive to list here and out of this scope, not in this book, but it's definitely worth its own research on another time. And on page 2, on the same page, they name Paul Lazarsfeld, who works for the committees ran by the foundations, whose name appears over and over again on the rolls of the foundations, and another member with ties to Frankfurt School, and has ties to the Tavistock Institute. Now, this is the deep topic for another day, but still more associations to remember. Kind of briefly gets into a little bit with Lily Kay's book. And again, page 247, Wormer lists all of the associations of the Ford Foundation's Behavioral Science Fund. Wormer notes the overlap and interlock with foundations, RAND, the University Research and Development Departments with the Human Behavior Research, and again, a deeper topic next in Lily Kay's book. On page 284, the Ford Foundation's control over Harvard and the directing of the behavioral sciences. $2 million was spent on the use of sociology, psychology, and anthropology in teaching of business administration at Harvard. They brought in Sam Stouffer, who worked in the War Department on an operation of human behavior experiments for control. He also did experiments on college students at University of Chicago as well as Harvard. At his new job at business school at Harvard, he will lead a program of research in the area of consumer behavior. So all of the experiments once done on soldiers and students will be performed on you, the consumer, using tax-exempt money while you get taxed on everything. Now, this was already done in law schools, as noted by Wormer on this page. And that's pretty much it. That's the book. I'm gonna take you back to page 206 real quick. When discussing the impact on foreign policy, page 206, Wormer talks about the influence of this foundation, the Carnegie Foundation, may be illustrated by the functions held by its former president, Alger Hiss. Some of you know the infamous Alger Hiss. He was appointed as a spy for the KGB. He denied it. Former dupe showed evidence that Hiss did give him State Department secrets, and so he was convicted of perjury. So he went down as, one of the communist spies that infiltrated the State Department. Now, he was a trustee of the Woodrow Wilson Foundation, a director of the Executive Committee of the American Association for the United Nations, a director of the American Peace Society, and a trustee of the World Peace Society or Peace Federation, and a director of the American Institute of Pacific Relations. His background, Alger's background. He went to Harvard, check. He worked in the State Department, check. During the war, he was heavily involved in post-war planning and laying the foundations for the UN. In early 1945, he was part of the State Department contingent that traveled to Yalta with President Roosevelt and that spring he served as Secretary General of the UN Organizing Conference in San Francisco. Now, what does Quigley say of Alger Hiss? Now, I'm reading from page 938 of Tragedy and Hope. In spite of the great influence of this Wall Street alignment, an influence great enough to merit the name of the American establishment, this group could not control the federal government, and in consequence had to adjust to a good many government actions thoroughly distasteful to the group. The chief of these were in taxation law, beginning with the graduated income tax in 1913, but culminating, above all else, in the inheritance tax. These tax laws drove the great private fortunes dominated by Wall Street into tax-exempt foundations, which became a major link in the establishment network between Wall Street, the Ivy League, the federal government. Dean Rusk, Secretary of State after 1961, formerly president of the Rockefeller Foundation and Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, is as much a member of this nexus as Alger Hiss.